So I'm a professor of innovation management at MDU in IDT in Eskilstuna. I came across here from Anglia Ruskin University, where I was a professor for about 10 years in technology and organization studies. And prior to that, I was Newcastle University, where I was a senior lecturer. Prior to that, Manchester University, where I did my PhD and was a researcher for a short while. So this is probably the biggest project I'm working on at the minute. It's a Horizon Europe project, about 5 million euros. So 5 million, yeah, 5 million, yeah. It's a lot of money. So it's involving a number of countries. So we're leading it here, MDU, and involving Anglia Ruskin, my old university, and Milan University, Lancaster University. And the idea of the project is to try and understand the extent to which manufacturing, in the UK, Germany, and Italy is digitalizing. So the idea is to look at that and the implications of that for working life and for firm strategy around technology innovation, and the concept also of Industry 5.0. So we've had, or we're having, Industry 4.0, which is the transformation of manufacturing industries using robots and AI and other digital systems. But the idea is that there's a kind of problem with this because it's really embedded in the idea that we have to grow, become more efficient, produce more, etc., etc. You know, the kind of old industry story. And clearly, this has a problem for sustainability and it has a problem for work life as well. So what we're looking at is, and actually firm resilience also. So what we're looking at is, can we find signs that, or indications that firms are thinking a bit beyond this, a bit beyond just growth, and acceleration and accumulation, and thinking more about, well, how sustainable is this for the environment? How sustainable is this for the firm? Can we keep growing and competing? Is that what we want to do? What's this doing to skills? What's this doing to the retention of skills and good workers? Because, many people are retiring early because work is becoming so intense, and digital technologies and AI have got a lot to do with this, the kind of intensification of work. So people are retiring early, people don't want to go into industry. So is that really sustainable? So we talk about 5.0, can we make this digital transformation more human centric? Can we think, instead of just speeding up work, making work more intense, producing workplaces where there's less downtime, for example, can we think more about, well, let's make work a positive place to be, somewhere people want to go? And clearly, industries all around Europe really have to think about this, because people don't want to go and work in manufacturing firms. They want to go and work in offices. They want to go and work in sales teams or become coders or work with AI. So industries become kind of unattractive. And at some level, industry itself is culpable in that. There tends to be a story that not enough new skilled workers are being trained, and we need to improve and increase training. But there's no point doing that if people don't want to go into industry. So industry's got a role to play here, and we're looking at that. So yeah, that's what the project's about. Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating because it's at the heart of what's going wrong in Western economies. Um, this notion of acceleration of life just speeding up. So, we can't sustain this forever. I think a good example of this acceleration is, we have another project in banking. So I'll use banking as an example. So if you're, someone who sells mortgages to people, and you interview the person and you make an assessment of them, you collect some information about their financial background, you look at the market for mortgages and, what sort of interest rates are being charged. So you make this kind of all-round assessment, and then you deal with the legal side of it, et cetera, et cetera. So you might be even photocopying documents for the client, for the customer to sign, all that sort of stuff. So a lot of the work that you do is quite mixed. It involves photocopying, it involves reading, it involves talking to the client, it involves doing research. But then what banking is doing at the minute is bringing in AIs, which will do all of that work. So what you as a human being as a worker in a bank get left with is just dealing with the customers. The contracts are written, you don't have to check them. The assessment of what sort of, interest rate you might offer them is already done for you. You don't have to make that decision. So your work just becomes extremely intense, and I think it becomes undoable really after a while, because then you get, you're alienated from the day-to-day doing of the work. All the answers are there in front of you, so you have this sense of detachment. You sense that work is accelerating, so you just burn out. That's the absolute recipe for burnout. So what's the response to this? Well, perhaps people work in that job for 2 to 3 to 4 years and then burn out, and they get somebody else to come do that job. And that job's been simplified, of course. It just becomes a sales job. So is that really what we want? So it's at the heart of this notion of acceleration and the problem this is causing for society. But at the same time, it's also in another space, which is about this kind of story of Industry 4.0, digital technology, AI is going to spread through society, spread through industry like wildfire. Sorry, just kill that. Spread through industry like wildfire and transform, the whole of society, the whole of industry. And we have to think about how we adapt to that future. But actually, this is not really what we're seeing in industry. Most manufacturing firms are small to medium-sized enterprises. And many of these firms are barely interested in automating work, let alone bringing in AI. And why is that? Well, because there's a sort of equilibrium there already. Customers are prepared to pay a certain price for the product they make. The product costs what it costs to make. The workers in the factory live in the region, as do quite often the owners, and the children of those workers might be going to the same schools as the owners of those production sites. So there's very little motivation to fire people and replace them with robots, for example. Why would you want to do that? Many of these firm owners, and these are millions, right, are already making good living. Why bring on board the risk of automation, of playing around with AI, all of this sort of stuff, because it costs money to do that. Why make those investments when things are already working? So we call those satisficers. Yeah, they're kind of happy with the status quo. Why change things? Now, if you look at the documentation from the European Union and consultancies, they see this as a huge problem. They call this barriers to innovation and barriers to Industry 4.0. But they're not really barriers. They're just the sort of the reality of life working in this sector. And that is fascinating. And they have many old machines around the factory. They might have a digital printer standing next to a lathe, which is from the 1950s, which they bought from Milwaukee, 50 years ago, sort of thing. So this kind of strange mixed ecology of old machines, old skills, new skills, digital printing, next to a computerized, stock allocation system, next to a huge grinding machine that has to be operated by hand, and you physically take weights and put it on the machine to make it press harder. So you've got this strange mixed world that is not about to change overnight. Other things we found is that some of the products that are made, some products which are very, very important to us, in food processing, for example, these are made by machines that are almost irreplaceable. So their focus is on maintaining and keeping these machines running. We found an instance, and this is very interesting, how kind of skills and machines go together. You can't just separate them and automate. They buy a new old machine from another manufacturer that they need, and the worker has to come with it, because the worker is the only person who knows how, that person is the only person in the region who knows how to run that machine. So they're kind of tied together, and when that person retires, then what happens next? So these are the sort of problems, the real kind of everyday problems. And it's much more interesting than reading consultancy reports about how, the digital transformation. So our view is that the view coming out of the project is that this digital transformation is going to be much less far-reaching and much slower than we are led to believe, and that in 50 years' time, many of these old machines are still going to be in operation, and many of these old skills are still going to be needed. I think the implications of our work that when you say rational, I mean that's a problematic notion in itself because rationality is always local. It's always to a given society, for example, at a given point in time. So what's reasonable to say in a board meeting today is if you were to kind of stop the CEO from talking, saying, hang on a minute, you're talking about returns to investors within 5 years. Shouldn't we be talking about maintaining the workforce over the next 30 years? Well, the CEO would see that as irrational in that particular firm. Okay, come on, be reasonable, would be the response. We have to think about our investors, etc., 5-year returns, this sort of thing. This is what our investors are interested in. We owe them a lot of money. So this is what's rational here. But in a small firm in Germany that's family owned and doesn't have these contexts, then it's absolutely rational to worry about, is this firm going to be here in 30 years' time? Where do we get the skills from? Do we want to borrow money because that brings risk to us and changes how we think? So rationality is always really a local thing. So what's rational to do today is not necessarily rational to do tomorrow. It used to be rational for industrialists in the Industrial Revolution in Britain to argue that they could not operate without having children as workers. That was their rationality. We would not have that conversation ever today. It would be irrational to suggest, hey, can we not get more? Let's get children out of school and get them working in factories. You wouldn't be able to do that. So that's the first point. That's always a local and sat in a particular time what is rational. So when you talk about rationalizing work, then you run into problems immediately. So I think you have to not use terms like rationality or and use terms like, acceleration, human centric. Okay, so be specific about what you mean. So when you bring this technology into the workplace, what is it actually going to do? What's the experience going to be? Is it going to be of speeding up work? Is it going to be of taking over work that you don't want to do? Is it going to be of taking over work that is dangerous? But even there you run into problems because some people, they like to do dangerous work. They don't mind climbing up the outside of that building. They think that's fun. Yeah. So what you decide is important and what the technology should do is always local, contextual, we say relational, embedded in its context. So that's how you have to think, what's this technology? How is this technology? These are the questions that we ask. How is this technology going to change how work is done? And what does that mean to those people? And also we can't, if you talk about rationality, we might say, well, it's rational that people don't want to do dirty work, for example, or boring work even. But that's not necessarily, that might be rational from your perspective, but from their perspective, boring job might be just what they want. Drilling a hole in the same piece of metal day in, day out might be just what their brain needs. They're relaxed, they do their exciting stuff outside of work. Who are we to say something's right or wrong, rational or irrational? You have to go and find out. That's what research is for. Well, I think one of the problems we see if you look across history, and we've done quite a lot of reading in this project, previous industrial revolutions, for example, is one of the key shapers of what happens is who has the power to decide what is rational, for example. Who has the power? Who's writing the checks? Who's influencing regulation? Which groups is it? So when you get industry, CEOs, investors, shareholders, when they become too powerful, as they probably are right now, and the workers themselves, they lose their voice, they might have some representation, but, as in Sweden, for example, we have this co-determination where workers can be informed about or should be kept up to date as to what's happening in the firm. But that's not the same as having the power to stop it. That's not the same as having the power to express their view of what a good working life looks like, or even just what is fair, for example. So, in the previous big industrial revolution, the 1800s, workers had almost no power. And there's really good examples of when they did get a bit of power, usually because they were very, very skilled. That would end up being the focus for automation. And the focus for automation was not necessary to make things more efficient. It was to get rid of those workers because they were gathering power. Weavers, spinners, sorry, was a good example of that. A lot of automation around their work because spinners became very skilled, very powerful, very influential in the organization. They could stop production if they wanted to by refusing to work. So they were seen as very. So it's about power and who has the power. So when workers can threaten to walk out very easily, then, owners of firms, owners of manufacturers tend to favor technologies which support work. We call that augmentation, rather than technologies which replace workers. We call that automation. So, Ford Motor Company is a very good example of this. They have a long history of conflict with their workforces, and their workforces have a very, very strong sense of their own power, and they do walk out and stop production. So Ford Motor Company is, and this is one of our studies, actually, is a partner in the project. They're very cautious about how they bring technology in and what technology they bring in. So, they'll focus on augmenting workers, making them more productive without making work unpleasant or dangerous, rather than replacing workers with automation, because as soon as the workers get a sense that's happened, they'll go out and strike, And I think that's, we tend to view that quite negatively in our societies today, inconvenience to the public of strikes and all of this sort of thing. But we are the public, as us. So, we have to ensure that, our lives aren't made utterly miserable just because the shareholders want better returns. You have to balance that power out. But we're not in that situation. We're in a very, very weak and vulnerable situation, which is why technology looks the way it does, which is why there's so few limits on AI and its development, because we just don't have a strong enough voice. We don't have people in politics reflecting, the sort of good society we want to build. They're more focused on growth, for example, economic growth. Well, it hasn't finished yet, so we're still doing the research, but the early conclusions are, I would say, and I'm sticking my neck out a little bit here, the technology change is going to be slower than we think. The digitalization is just not going to affect some parts of industry. And the fact that they've got a computer in the office and maybe a CNC machine is kind of neither here nor there, really. We're going to see a lot of old machinery is going to continue living and continue being used, and a lot of old skills are going to continue being required. We call this, as I've said, the strange mixed ecology of firms, these kind of micro ecologies where all of these things have to come together. So we're not going to see, in many sectors, we're just not going to see this big digital transformation. We probably will see it in banking, for example, but we probably won't see it amongst smaller manufacturing firms. And smaller manufacturing firms make up, 90% of the bulk of manufacturing itself. So we will see big changes in corporates, because corporates, firms that have firms that are deeply indebted to investors, let's put it in a negative way, we'll see those firms digitalizing more quickly, because they will need to be rational, and they will need to cut costs, and they will need to show returns to shareholders. So they will transform more quickly than the manufacturing sector, and the construction sector is never going to digitalize. I promise you that. People are still going to put bricks on top of each other with concrete. The answer is it depends. It depends what you're looking at, what industry, what part of the industry, what's the power balance between workers and owners. That determines whether it's augmentation or automation. But I would say that automation is favored at the minute. One thing we see, for example, this idea of cobots. If you go onto YouTube and search for cobots and watch, 5 videos of cobots, what you'll see in 4 out of 5 of those videos on average is just the cobot is just learning how to do that person's job. They're not collaborating in any way whatsoever. I mean, the term cobot is applied to so many things, which is clearly just a robot, and the human's teaching it to do the job. That's not collaboration.